You may remember the Chanel video of Cara Delevingne and Pharrell Williams as Empress Sisi and her husband Emperor Francis Joseph. Of course, we see the dirndl. There was another interpretation of the dirndl which I personally liked because it looked a bit like the dirndl but not too much. And if we see a dirndl, of course we also see the Lederhosen. And he paired the traditional Lederhosen also with biker jackets. So I think this is really nice that he created kind of like a fantasy version of the Tracht. Hi, my name is Liz. I'm a fashion and art historian and the founder of the fashion label Pelagona, and on this channel I'm telling you the stories behind fashion trends. As you can see, I'm still in my dirndl. I'm in Dirndl-mood. The Oktoberfest has been going on. My feed is full of people in Trachten, and this actually reminded me of something that I would like to discuss here. The dirndl is mostly being associated with these more traditional festivals, like the beer festivals like the Oktoberfest or the Kirchtage in Austria, but it is actually a reflection of fashion, also of economic developments and the relationship of people and clothes. And the dirndl has served as a source of inspiration for many designers. And today I'm going to tell you the story when the dirndl walked the runway. Let me take you to the Chanel Métiers d'Art runway show in 2015, which took place in Salzburg in Austria. You may remember the Chanel video of Cara Delevingne and Pharrell Williams as Empress Sisi and her husband Emperor Francis Joseph. At first I was a bit conflicted. I thought this looked too much like obvious Austrian marketing with our stereotypes, but there's actually a story behind and the reason why Karl Lagerfeld chose Empress Sisi for this. The first one is Romy Schneider. She was the actress who played Sissy in the famous Sissy movies, and she was also a Chanel customer, and in the 1970s she wore Chanel creations in the movies directed by Visconti. The second reason was Empress Sisi herself, who was a big fan of the dirndl. This is no surprise. She was Bavarian. She then married Francis Joseph in Vienna, and as I mentioned in my previous video, the elites from Austria and also the Viennese court spent their summer holidays in the countryside. Sisi very often went to the Salzkammergut near Salzburg, and this is where they then wore the dirndl. So it was a very calculated move by Lagerfeld, and as you will see, this collection is heavily inspired by the Tracht, but it shows a more fantastical view of the Tracht. This is typical Lagerfeld. I don't think his goal was to show the traditional, original Tracht. He took some elements of the Tracht and mixed them with current movements and brought them to the runway. And this brings me to the setting of the runway show. It took place in the famous Schloss Leopoldskron. Yes, this is the palace of Sound of Music, and it would not be Karl Lagerfeld if there was no element of Rococo in there. It is actually a Rococo palace, and we know from my previous videos about the designer that he had a big passion for the 18th century. So why did Lagerfeld choose this Trachten theme? He was German, but he came from the northern parts where they don't have the Tracht, but there are pictures of him already as a small boy in Lederhosen and later on as a teenager, and he even said in interviews that he very much enjoyed wearing this type of garment and that the Tracht really inspired him. And when Hudson Krönig, the young boy in the Lederhosen, walked down the runway, many people then said they actually saw the little Karl Lagerfeld, the young boy in the Lederhosen as well. Now let's analyze the garments. I would say some of them were more obvious representations of the Tracht and some creations were more subtle. I would like to start with the more obvious parts. Of course, we see the dirndl. There was one dirndl that was black. It was with a sheer fabric, and we could say it's a modern interpretation of the garment. There was another interpretation of the dirndl which I personally liked because it looked a bit like the dirndl but not too much. It could be just a normal dress, and then it had this signature embroidery on it in the colors that are so typical for the Trachten, this white, red, green, blue, and the contrast with the black was, in my opinion, really nice. And there was one interpretation which we could call a bit avant-garde. It was a narrow dress with a floral print, and then the model wore a kind of leather corsage over it. It referenced the dirndl corsage, and I personally think it looks a bit like the simpler dirndls, like the Leibkittel from the Salzkammergut in Upper Austria. There was one detail which I noticed which reminded me of the dirndl blouses, the lace blouses. It was in contrast with the black and the contrast white is also something that you very often see in the Trachten garments. And if we see a dirndl, of course we also see the Lederhosen. Some of the Lederhosen were more classic. we see the typical design, but maybe a bit shortened. Then he paired it with the signature Trachten jackets, but it wouldn't be Lagerfeld if he didn't mix the styles. And he paired the traditional Lederhosen also with biker jackets. There's also one outfit that has long pants and the pattern of the Lederhosen. And one interpretation that I liked was a Lederhosen set paired with a cardigan that was very colorful, and it kind of gave me the feeling the Lederhosen is going shopping in the city. Another more subtle interpretation of the Lederhosen was the upper part that holds the Lederhosen in place. It was taken onto a sheer top, and it looks very feminine, so I find this mix of the male Lederhosen with this feminine and floral topic quite interesting. In general, Lagerfeld also referenced the Lederhosen just by the use of the suede material. There were outfits that incorporated this brown suede material, and you knew it comes from the Lederhosen, but it was actually used for a different type of garment. Another signature thing is knitwear in the Tracht, and it wouldn't be Chanel if we didn't see jackets, so we see many different interpretations of the traditional Trachten knitwear, but Lagerfeld also created more contemporary looking jackets that reference the Trachten with the color scheme, and they sometimes had floral patterns on them, so it was kind of a mix. On the one hand, it was this obvious Trachten knitwear. On the other hand, it was maybe, let's say, Trachten 2.0 taken to the next level. And this also leads me to the color scheme. There was a lot of dark green, the typical hunting green, which is so typical also of the Trachten in the German-speaking regions. There was a lot of red, blue, white. There was naturally also a lot of brown. And this also brings me to the accessories. For example, there was this hat that really reminded me of the hats that are worn across the regions in Bavaria, in some regions also of Tyrol, for example. And then I spotted the interpretation of the charivari. What is the charivari? The charivari is a kind of necklace in silver, and it has different things on it. Usually it's souvenirs from shooting days, and the people who have visited Oktoberfest notice the charivari is usually an accessory that is worn on the Lederhosen. And what did Lagerfeld do with it? He took this charivari as an accessory with a very simple dress, and this dress, in my opinion, is also a reference of the very simple Trachten shirts for men. Another signature accessory from the Trachten which Lagerfeld incorporated is the choker. It's called the Kropfband, and this was actually used by women who had this goiter. I don't know if I said this correctly in English, and they used this necklace to cover up this part of the body, and it still remains until today. It is a very popular accessory with the Dirndl. Lagerfeld used it in the original sense, let's say. He used it as a necklace, but he also incorporated elements of these chokers into his belts. And it wouldn't be Trachten-inspired if there were no white stockings, which are also a signature accessory of the Trachten, and they come up in many ways during this collection. Sometimes they are worn as tights, sometimes as stockings, and very often they are embroidered. And this brings me to the floral embroidery that throughout the show you could see that many items were embroidered with the typical Trachten floral motifs. And very popular motif is the Edelweiss. This brings me back to Sound of Music. You probably know that flower which grows in the Alps, and it is a very popular motif for the Trachten, and Lagerfeld incorporated it. Sometimes more obvious in certain cases than in others. There were some dresses that had these obvious flowers on them. I have to say I was not a big fan of those. And this brings me to another important pattern. It is very common in the Trachten to also depict landscapes. For example, animals or plants. As a child, I had a Trachten cardigan, a knit cardigan that my mom made for me with ducks on them. So this is quite a common theme, and Lagerfeld picked this up, and there was one dress that also had kind of like an embroidery theme that could be, I think, a pond scene or something. So I think this was a very nice, subtle way of incorporating the Trachten topic. And for me, these more subtle interpretations of the Tracht were the most successful items of the collection. In general, I appreciated that Lagerfeld took up the Tracht as a topic, but I think he really showed how he understood everything in the more subtle version. So we have top skirt combinations that work really well because they use materials that might be feathers. They use the color schemes of the Trachten. There is a dress with a feather print that I really liked, and I think this is really, really nice. What he also did, and again similar to the Paris Bombay Métiers d'Art runway show or collection, is that he had signature Chanel items. They look like Chanel from afar. You can tell it. For example, there was a red coat. When I see this on the street, I can see that this is Chanel, but at a closer look, we see that there are tiny red balls on it, and this references the Bollenhut from the Schwarzwald. And again, similar to Karl Lagerfeld's Orientalism approach, even here, he created more a fantasy Tracht. It's not a Tracht that you would see in a certain region, and this was also not his goal, not at all. I think he wanted to create kind of something in his mind, how he would see the Tracht, and there were some really nice creations where I looked at it, I saw the Tracht, but then I saw the pattern and I was like, could be more Eastern European. There's also a nice outfit in black and white, which has a nod to the Edelweiss, so it brings me back to this more subtle approach. I think this is really nice that he created kind of like a fantasy version of the Tracht. And this is the end of my video. I would like to know, what did you think about this collection? Did you like it? Did you enjoy Lagerfeld's interpretation of the Tracht? Let me know in the comments below. I have also written an article on thepinklookbook.com, and if you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. Thank you very much for watching. Servus and goodbye.